Greetings, greetings all. Welcome. Happy to see some familiar faces and some familiar names among those gathered this evening. Welcome to this space and to the roundtable discussion to welcome another wonderful and very important and insightful publication to the canon of Caribbean art history, which sits interestingly poised between art history and visual culture and cultural criticism. And so this evening, we have a panel of an interesting range of panelists who will be engaging with Dr. Therese Hadchity and on her book, The Making of a Caribbean Avant-Garde, Postmodernism as Post-Nationalism. Now, the thing about publications is that there are times that they come through right in a moment where they can be, they enter into our consciousness at a moment that is ripe, where we're anticipating it, we're waiting for it, and we know it's coming. Therese being such a humble person, and often, lying low, but doing some incredible and important work. This book slipped through, but it slipped through not, when I say it slipped through, I'm speaking of that it was published right in the midst of a global pandemic in August of 2020 by Purdue University Press. And in the midst of various lockdowns, global lockdowns from Europe to South America, the Americas in general, and right here at home in the Caribbean, the book came and it entered into our sphere without much notice. And we didn't want this to be lost upon us. We didn't want the pandemic to erase this moment, to mark this very, this moment of this text becoming available. And we wanted to present an opportunity to have a moment of exchange. And we were cautious not to call it a launch per se because of the fact of the delayed ability for us to actually gather and give it a space to really converse about it. But we also didn't want the moment to pass because it is truly a tour de force and an important text that, as you will soon see, that straddles quite an expansive art historical trajectory. And we wanted to ensure that we were able to bring it to a virtual audience and share it with you in this occasion and with the interlocutors we have with us this evening, of which I will introduce, and then I will turn the floor over to our first speaker. So our panelists today, our esteemed panelists today include Dr. Petrina Dacres, who is head of art history at the Edna Manley College of the Visual and Performing Arts. Her teaching, research, and writing focuses on Caribbean art, African diaspora art, public sculpture and memorials, and memory studies. She is also a founding member of the Tide Rising Art Projects, an organization created to support and promote contemporary Caribbean art and film. Dr. Dacres is also a recent curatorial fellow at the International Studio and Curatorial Program. Russell Watson is an artist and educator, working in theater and digital imaging. He studied drama and education and theater arts at the Edna Manley College in Jamaica and film, video, and new media at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. He has been curator of art and media at Chicago's historic Hot House Center for Performing Art and Youth Program coordinator at New York's Studio Museum in Harlem. His feature film, A Handful of Dirt, won the 2011 Real World Film Festival Audience Award and was nominated for the 2011 Pan-African Film Festival's Best Feature Director Award. He's currently a lecturer in film in the Faculty of Culture, Creative and Performing Arts at UWI Cave Hill and runs Our Studio, a multimedia workshop established in 2010 that offers digital imaging services to a diverse client base, including corporate entities, government agencies, theater companies, fine artists, as well as academics. Next, we have Andrea Wells, a cultural administrator with 30 years of experience, 20 of these at a senior level. She is well known among her peers in the region and possesses a Master of Arts in Cultural Studies from the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus. She has been a consistent member of CARICOM's Regional Cultural Committee for over a decade and active in the advisory of CARIFESTA, the Caribbean Festival of Arts, via CARICOM's interim festival directorate. She is intimately knowledgeable about this festival and its invariable challenges as executed by different member states. In the role of festival director, she led the implementation of the 13th edition of CARIFESTA held in Barbados, August 17 to 27 in 2017. And we have Therese Hadchity, Dr. Hadchity, who was born in Denmark and moved to Barbados in 1990. She studied art history and contemporary culture at Copenhagen University, and from 2000 to 2010 ran the Zamacon Gallery in Bridgetown, Barbados. Since the late 1990s, she has worked as a freelance curator and art writer. She currently teaches as a temporary lecturer in cultural studies at the Faculty of Culture, Creative and Performing Arts at UWI Cave Hill and the Barbados Community College. And we have with us our esteemed Dean, Dr. David Akombo, and I want to welcome also in this audience Jonathan Greenland, former director of the National Art Gallery in Jamaica and former manager of the Errol Barrow Center for Creative Imagination, Mr. Harclyde Walcott, and I hope I'm not missing anyone else, but all of you who are present, thank you for being here. I'm Dr. Yanique Hume. I'm the acting head of cultural studies and a lecturer as well in the program. And I am delighted again to have you all share this space with us. And the format it will take is fairly, it's formal yet informal in that there is a structure that is holding us together in terms of our engagement. But then we want to leave some space and room for audience participation. We want to make it as interactive as possible. So we're going to start with Therese, who's going to just give us an overview of what really prompted this project and the genesis for this work. And the audience, one of the leading questions I would start with is who she imagined she was talking to, the audience or publics of which this text is targeted. And then from her overview, we're going to then have our panelists present for about 10 or so minutes on their takeaways from the text. And then there'll be some guided questions, and then we open it up certainly for your questions to engage any of the points raised and to engage with Therese herself. So without further ado, welcome Therese, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Yanique, and for the introductions, and thank you also to Petrina, Andrea, and Russell, and everyone else for taking the time to be here. As many of you will know, I spent the first decade of this millennium running a small art gallery in Bridgetown, Barbados. During that decade, it became clear to me that the Caribbean art scene was undergoing its own kind of climate change. While one set of artists suddenly gained traction, it felt as if many others had been prematurely retired before they, in any sense of the word, had reaped the rewards of their long-standing investment in the field. The clearest manifestation of this change took place in the critical writing around the visual arts, which now took a more academic turn and started to echo broader cultural studies debates as influenced by Derrida, Foucault, Butler, Hall, Gilroy, Scott, etc. Some of the things Caribbean artists had been fighting for decades to achieve, such as sovereignty, institutional infrastructure, the development of national unity, and a discrete cultural identity, were being challenged, and so were the means by which they had been trying to achieve them. Gestures that used to be seen as progressive and even rebellious now came to be regarded as conservative. So when the gallery closed and I went back to school, right here in the Cultural Studies program at Cave Hill, It was with the intention to try and understand what it was I had witnessed and to a degree participated in while bumbling along, and what that transition had more fundamentally been about. The result is, of course, the book that we're here to discuss. I think the moment I knew that I had to undertake this project was when Infinite Island, the large survey exhibition, opened in New York in 2007. Perhaps a bit naively, I was stunned to find that what I saw in the catalogue was a completely homogenized and somehow sanitized representation of Caribbean art, which bore almost no relationship to the lived reality around me. A few weeks later, I was equally stunned by the condescending tone of some of the reviews, which suggested that the show didn't really measure up to New York expectations, not because its representation of Caribbean art was weirdly sanitized, but rather because the Caribbean contemporary wasn't contemporary enough. Until this moment, I had had little idea that such shows are not necessarily motivated by any real interest in the Caribbean art scene at all, but often tied to overarching political agendas. So my project sprang from a desire to determine, among other things, what it is that distinguishes the kind of Caribbean art that currently makes it into prestigious metropolitan survey shows. Technically, the starting point was therefore what is now the last segment of the book, which tries to trace changes in the selection and critical framing of Caribbean art for international exhibitions over the last 2.5 decades. The next, and in many ways far more challenging step, which is now the first section of the book, was an attempt to describe and understand the corresponding changes in artistic practices and discourse around Caribbean art when the euphoria and hopefulness around independence had worn off. This is what I characterize as a transition from an anti-colonial nationalism to a cosmopolitan anti-nationalism, or more simply put, the evolution that led from artists saying, "Look at how beautiful we are," to saying, "Look at what we've become," to finally saying, "What do we even mean by we?" So I not only wanted to understand what motivated the migration from old media like painting and sculpture to new media like installation, performance, and video art, but the simultaneous and more significant thematic movement from preoccupations with process rather than product, with migration, hybridity, liminality, as well as strategies of irony and indirection. In essence, I wanted to understand the character of postmodernism in a region where the experience of modernity, the whole trajectory of it, was very different from what it was in the regions where postmodernism and its attendant body of theory had originated. I was particularly interested in the compounded critique of the older formation I've labeled Creole modernism, and which I think was generally misunderstood. From abroad, where the art world was now moving into the era of pop and postmodernism, that critique was simply centered on a perceived relatedness. In the Caribbean, it was centered on an alleged elitism and a perceived compliance with a foreign script. But that critique, in my view at least, loses sight of the ways in which some Caribbean artists of the anti-colonial generation tried to refashion modernism to accommodate a local audience and still stake a claim in modernity. One of my broader points is that the next generation's embrace of a cosmopolitan expression, which precisely may have resulted from the previous generation's lingering stigma of belatedness, is quite deliberately aimed at a foreign gaze and inadvertently follows a foreign script. Since the pioneers of this post-nationalist movement often coincided with the pioneers of the so-called alternative spaces that started to pop up in the region in the early 2000s, I also had to look at changes in the institutional landscape, or as it were, the lack of change in the almost non-existing institutional landscape, which precisely stimulated these initiatives. My challenge then became that of explaining how all of this is part of the same picture, which arguably is the book's overall point. This, however, began to fall into place when I started to wonder what a neoliberal imaginary would look like. The surprising thing is how appealing this imaginary might appear, and how easily a grassroots movement that sees itself as nothing if not progressive can start to align itself with that imaginary, which of course is centered on things like civil society initiative, skepticism of institutions and of the state, networking as the default solution to any problem of marginalization, and wholesale privatization. So my critical approach simply became that of asking, which political agenda is not troubled by these developments? For example, the conceptual transition from a global margin-centered model to diasporic frames of reference and ideas of global entanglement, or indeed from former generations' hopes of forging an inclusive and egalitarian society to the explicit desire, the desire for permanent pluralism. Very rarely did I find the obvious beneficiary to be the disenfranchised Caribbean artist. And so some of the key takeaways are as follows. Number one, the logic of neoliberalism is incredibly insidious and finds expression in unexpected places. Number two, when the margins move to the center and alternative spaces, albeit inadvertently, become proxy institutions, and when the center in turn reaches for the margins, that is, when institutions want to occupy both center and margins, it precludes a healthy critical dynamic. Number three, networks are often less transparent than the old hierarchical structures they're supposed to replace, and quite exclusionary as well. As a solution to underfunded and infrastructure-deprived arts communities, informal networks are a neoliberal dream, but also a nightmare for artists who lack the social capital to navigate them. Number four, the attention to issues of representation and the gaze has displaced older concerns with material inequality, and the, albeit obviously important, focus on individual experience and difference seems to have permanently displaced any collective agenda. And finally, number five, while a lot of attention has been paid, and often rightly so, to the political failings of the previous generation, we have forgotten to hold the current avant-garde politically accountable. And I think my time is up, but before I hand over to the other panelists, I would just like to say one more thing. I am well aware that the strategies I describe and critique in the book are developed and embraced by artists who do not act in bad faith and who are ultimately trying to succeed and survive with very little institutional or even moral support. And so if this is a forceful and opinionated book, it's because I believe critique is the only way of signaling to others that you take them seriously and that what they do is both important and consequential. And if in response to your question, Yanique, I imagine the audience that I was writing for was younger artists and maybe a little bit wishfully curators who I think need to be sensitized to what it is they're not obviously going to be guided towards when they come to the Caribbean. And younger artists who I would wish have at least, who can make up their own opinions about this whole scenario, but I think who need to understand the context in which what is the current lingua franca of the of Caribbean avant-garde art, how it evolved and what some of its corollaries and inflections could be. So,
Wonderful.
That's my bit, and I'm interested to hear what the panelists have to say.
Great. Thank you, Therese. Thank you for that overview, which really, shows the breadth and scope of which this project emerges and the various conversations it leads us through and to. And so I am thinking about, the differently positioned panelists who are here this evening. I wanted to begin with a dear friend and former classmate, Dr. Petrina Dacres, from the position of someone who is versed within Caribbean art history and familiar with these debates almost quite intimately in terms of some of the debates that you are speaking of, especially the conceptual structuring of the main arguments between the Creole modernism and the the anti-nationalist conversations and the critics of which have led this charge. I wanted to start with Petrina to begin to kind of speak to how she entered this book and also what were some of the takeaways from her vantage point of working at the Edna Manley College of the Visual and Performing Arts and having worked at the National Gallery in Jamaica and being situated in Jamaica, but also straddling her curatorial work between sites in the Caribbean, specifically Jamaica, as well as in New York and further afield. So, Petrina, the floor is yours now.
Well, firstly, I want to thank Yanique for organizing this event and Dr. Hadchity for opening up this conversation on Caribbean art. Russell, it's really good to see you again. And Miss Andrea Wells, or is it Dr. Andrea Wells? I'm not sure, but I'm actually interested to hear what you have to say on this topic. So what I thought, what I did was to try to summarize some of the ideas which Dr. Hadchity has just summarized for her book. So you can correct me if I have misrepresented the ideas in your book. So the making of a Caribbean avant-garde reflects on Caribbean art in the 1990s and the types of aesthetics and exhibitionary strategies and conceptual frames that have shaped Caribbean art since then. The generation of artists and art critics that came to prominence in the 90s, Hadchity argues, prioritized conceptual, new media, and participatory art. And art critics like Annie Paul encouraged an engagement with popular culture to democratize our notion of art, to generate more audience interaction with fine art institutions and galleries, and quote, as a catalyst for popular self-representation as a marker of Caribbean identity. The book is critical of how the artistic generation of the 90s in the Anglophone Caribbean sought to differentiate themselves from the previous generation's investment in a Creole modernism that came out of an anti-colonial ethos and variously emphasized nationalist and Eurocentric values. Instead, she characterized the avant-garde approach, their practice, their ideas, exhibitions within which their work circulated, and residency programs in the region to being far more cosmopolitan, as she just mentioned, than the previous generation. This cosmopolitan turn, which, and I put that in quotes, she argues of the avant-garde generation has served the international aspirations of many of the artists and curators, but does very little to impact the inequalities within which art is practiced and consumed. Indeed, she argues the generation is, quote, less politically committed and is not truly invested in social restructuring, nor can it claim to be politically progressive if it, quote, denounces collective representation. And I think I would like to hear a little bit more, and I think the audience would like to hear, particularly the younger audience, more about that, which you have summarized. So I use the book as a point of departure from my own reflections of my research and practice in the field of Caribbean art, to bring some of her thoughts to the more micro level or personal level. I didn't really touch on my curatorial work just because in the interest of time. So just to declare my kind of positioning, I started teaching in Jamaica at the Edna Manley College in the early 2000s. I spent the 1990s mostly in the US in academic environments that really challenged the notion of the stable and essential nation, and that encouraged an understanding of the nation as a constructed process. In many ways, learning the academic discourse that Cozier and Paul, who were singled out in the book, Chris Cozier and Annie Paul, who were singled out in the book as icons of the 1990s avant-garde, were already putting into their practice in the region. So I'm part of that intellectual generation that, in fact, Hadchity criticized at one point in the book, that really developed what I would think a healthy suspicion to nation-state projects. As a child of the underclass in Jamaica and an immigrant to the US, and being part of the Caribbean diaspora also meant that coming to terms with my identity in the 1990s meant acknowledging the outsider experience of being poor in Jamaica and the failures of nation building projects to provide materially for its citizens. It also meant embracing my hybrid cultural experiences and also acknowledging the other keenly felt outsider experience as a US immigrant. So my own sociocultural experience meant that my romance with the nation state was always underdeveloped, even as I felt the need to return to the Caribbean to claim my own stake in it. All of this to say, on a very personal level, I understood the politics of the 90s generation outlined by Hadchity. Consequently, when I began to teach at Edna in the early 2000s, and I had to guide and review research interests of the fourth-year students who were about to graduate, I was really struck by the number of young people who were very much committed to nation building, cultural essentialism, and autonomy. The nationalist inflections of some of their work constantly surprised me, which is to say that the neat category of the 1990s and beyond as a kind of period of post-nationalist ethos that I felt that the book was describing was actually not as sort of cleanly delineated. I've also actually been particularly interested in the Jamaican context, at least, of artists who have inherited the nationalist iconography that came out of the immediate post-independence periods of the 1960s and 1970s, engaging them in their work to challenge or to ask new questions of nationalist belonging in the present. What Dr. Hadchity has just mentioned, what have we become? So as much as artists of this generation are invested in new art practices that are engaged with the concept of the nation and variously situate themselves to the nation state and to the neoliberal policies that govern them, which I think sorry, let me say that again. As much as artists of this generation are invested in new art practices, they are engaged with the concept of the nation and variously situate themselves to the nation state and to the neoliberal policies that govern them, which I think the book teases out at times, particularly in the chapters that explore alternative art spaces in the region. And of course, Dr. Hadchity indeed acknowledged this point, acknowledges by pointing to artists who do not express an explicitly anti-nationalist politics, such as Annalie Davis, who is connected to what she describes as a kind of civic nationalism. And in fact, wants to argue for, quote, the equal recognition of artists in this generation who have maintained some of the previous generation's aspirations, end quote. One feature of new art practices that fell outside of the discussion of the book is young artists who are committed to working within an older grand tradition of artistic practices. We see this particularly in the contemporary figurative paintings by, for example, Alicia Brown, Greg Bailey, whose work you see here, and Philip Thomas. These works are neither conceptual, participatory, and performance-based or new media-based, although they do use digital art in various ways. They instead refashion the tradition of image making in painting to question and consider Black subjectivity in the present, the way in which Black subjectivity in the post-colonial context of the Caribbean has been shaped by new ideas of power that emerged in the late 20th century, as well as the symbols and ideas we inherited from the colonial era. I think the presence of this category of work add another layer of complexity to Caribbean art of the post-90s period that Dr. Hadchity outlined. To sort of conclude, because I'm aware of time, I want to discuss the urge to kind of engage the popular that was touched on in the book. In my own teaching practice on Caribbean art history, I've highlighted the ways in which artists have used the popular in their work. Caribbean artists in the 19th and 20th century have represented popular traditions as subjects in their work. But I'm interested in helping students to think about how their cultural environment can be used as an aesthetic language in their work. And in regard, I feel a sort of connection to Annie Paul's call to think about the popular, and for artists to think about the popular, not purely as subjects, but as one of the formal and stylistic language from which they can draw on for their own aesthetic. So I'm not necessarily interested in saying that you must engage the popular, but being aware of that there is a wide range of language that one can use, including the language that is around them. So to recognize the take for granted images and practices as aesthetic language that they can adapt in their own image making. And moreover, to recognize the relationship of, for example, the costume of the abacoa, that and how it can be used to sort of to adapt abstraction, which Wilfredo Lam did in the 1940s and 50s, or the relationship between carnival, John Canoe, and performance art. The challenge for students has been how do they translate cultural forms outside of, for example, ritual into a language of art. Dr. Hadchity rightly mentioned the contemporary artist Ebony Patterson's work as one example of the use of the popular. So I would like to sort of end by discussing one of her works, which I've described elsewhere in the catalogue en masse by Krista Thompson and Pierre Talcon, who Dr. Hadchity had mentioned in her text. So, because I think it sort of speaks to, I think, some of the anxieties mentioned about the avant-garde use of the popular today. So for those of you who don't know, Ebony Patterson's performance, Invisible Presence, Bling Memories, occurred on April 27, 2014 during the Jamaica Carnival Road March in Kingston. The performance involved a parade of about 80 volunteers, including myself, 50 of whom carried decorated coffin-shaped sculptures. Each of the wooden frame sculptures were individually wrapped with various printed and lace fabrics with added trimmings and embellishments. The vivid collage of colors, surface pattern, and textures captured the assemblage aesthetic of Caribbean festival traditions, whereby multiple materials and objects are layered into a single costume, and their aesthetic of high affect that allow form that Judith Bettelheim described in her text on Caribbean festival tradition. That allows for sort of maximum visual impact. It also borrowed from the bling funeral aesthetics of contemporary Caribbean life and the older African diaspora expressive funerary tradition of ushering the dead into the afterlife with sculpture, music, and dance. Patterson's performance and intervention in the Jamaica Road March tried to raise questions of social access and visibility or invisibility in Jamaica Carnival, of particularly the poor and working class in Jamaica and their own traditions, while also referencing these other aspects of Jamaican popular culture, particularly the old mass tradition and dancehall. This was a work that had an added social significance, which viewed in the context of another work became evident. The Of 72 project, also based on the theme of death and visibility, which you see here on the slide. We see the artist drawing stylistically from kind of Christian iconic imagery, contemporary urban memorial practices of wall portraiture, dancehall dress aesthetic, and the sequin flags of Haitian voodoo ceremonies. Of 72 features a series of mixed media work on fabric, bandanas framing digital prints with floral patterns heavily embellished with embroidery and other decorative techniques. At the center of the bandanas are black and white portraits of young men whose faces are partially shrouded under layers of material. They reference the over 70 men, the actual number is disputed, who died or disappeared after the police and military went into the economically depressed community of Tivoli Gardens to arrest Christopher Dudas Coe, the reputed don of the West Kingston area. The work was inspired by the struggles of the families to retrieve the bodies of the disappeared and to give visibility to the youths whose names and images and the circumstances of their deaths are still denied to the public. The absent bodies interrogated in this work is further envisioned through the coffin sculptures in the public performance. Corporeality, bodies moving through space and activating the costumes and other objects that are attached to them, is an essential part of any carnival performance, and Patterson's work was no different. The laborious, tiring, at times even painful acts of carrying the coffins through the city streets in what we could liken to religious self-flagellation was not just important to the physical performance itself, but for us inhabiting the sculpture, and in so doing the lives of the marginalized and the over 72 persons who died in 2010. Pain inaugurated empathy for those of us involved in the performance, most of whom were actually from Jamaica's academic community. Many of them were students from Edna, Manley, or lecturers and other agents. For work that was about racialized and class bodies, it was significant that persons from Tivoli Gardens or other similar communities were largely physically absent from the performance. Tivoli community members, keenly aware of their precarious social positions and the trauma of the 2010 incursion, were hesitant to contribute to an event that required the endorsement of the same police who perpetrated violence against them. In their absence, we, a group of mostly artists, students, writers, and educators, became proxies for their bodies. In the experience of pain, we were forced to inhabit the position of the subjugated, but in our privileged position, we were never afraid of our own visibility. These aspects of the performance, liminality, and the visibility of working class experiences, culture, and aesthetics mediated through the body of the intellectual and artistic elite can be points of departure for critical thinking on the ways in which contemporary artists appropriate popular traditions. Despite the limitations of the work, I can acknowledge the particular level of radicality that the work has in terms of its social engagement and its innovative departure from formal traditions, without really demanding the artist to be politically progressive. And I wonder, Dr. Hadchity, if that's enough for you, despite your openness to art that doesn't have to be political. There seems to be an emphasis on political accountability, as you just mentioned. And so I wanted to end there to sort of ask us maybe as an audience member to kind of, and to you, Dr. Hadchity, to kind of really think about the investments that we have in artists to be politically engaged. And that's it.
Thank you, Therese. Thank you, Petrina, for this important intervention and for centering the popular, which does animate a good section of the text as it begins to explore, the interrelationship between the conceptual and the participatory, performative. And so, Therese, you want to address those now? Or would you like to gather them and then address them later on? Because I could.
I think maybe I'll just respond briefly. Because I think that Petrina made some very important points, and many of them are well taken. I wanted to just. I will not spend too long on it, but I wanted to say that you are right. That the question of it is difficult to gauge how deep the post-nationalist sentiment is. And certainly I have also noticed amongst my students that there is a continued investment in the nation and so on. I have not, my gaze was not really cast at what's happening in our schools and so on. I'm looking primarily at what finds its way abroad. And and in many ways, I think the post-nationalist is simply embedded in the works as a premise, and for the whole, especially at the level of discourse. And I do say quite explicitly, it's not always the individual artwork that can be said to be explicitly post-nationalist. It is sometimes in the surrounding discourse, where, I mean, cosmopolitan is inherently anti-nationalist. That's the whole point of it. And the diasporic premises also, it is an anti, or certainly post-nationalist framework. And I mean, I would say that at one point during my studies, I said to a fellow student, you know, I'm looking at the post-nationalist movement in cultural discourse, and she turned to me and she said, "Are you sure that there's been one?" And it was, you know, I understood where she was coming from, because at the local level, you can sometimes seem to be drowning in a sort of almost perverse nationalism. So I take your point, and incidentally, Philip Thomas and Camille Cheddar, precisely some of the artists, and you could say Kate Lovelace and several Barbadian artists that I'm aware of, have practiced what I call I haven't found the space. I've written about it elsewhere. What I call a kind of critical nationalism, which does not necessarily embark on this freewheeling cosmopolitanism, but it really does problematize the nation. And I think Camille Cheddar, maybe in particular, it has really expressed a concern for, you know, for the poor and the marginalized, which I very much respect. So you're asking about the political. Well, I mean, it's a ticklish question, because it is often said that it is not the job of the artist to be politically explicit and so on. But what we have here, I think, is a flirtation with political issues, and yet a very resolute uncommitment to any particular agenda of. And I mean, that is, I think, you know, there's definitely a resistance towards any kind of position taking, which, as far as I'm concerned, looks like it is not going to stand up for, let's say, economic redistribution, for instance. I think there's also a tendency to substitute quality with quantity, so that the demand for greater outreach, numbers, and more visibility and new narratives, as if all of this in itself is, you know, indicative of social progress. And I do think, I mean, there can be in the use of the popular, and I mean, I would not have participated in that parade without feeling deeply touched and stirred by it, for sure. But there can be an exploitative tendency in social practice works as well. There can be a tendency towards spectacle and so on, which becomes just another, you know, part of one's social agenda. And this idea that I think many seem to subscribe to, that the artwork in itself is inherently political, I think it's a little too facile. In fact, if this is what we think, I think that, you know, it might even have a sort of palliative effect and get in the way of actual political organization. I mean, if all it takes for me to be political is to go and participate in a parade, I don't think that I'm sufficiently alert to what being political actually means. And politics is about collective representation. That's what it is about, you know, that's all it is. And so this idea that we mustn't represent other people, speak for others, etc., is a way of antagonizing, you know, party politics as you know, as they have always been. So that is essentially what I meant.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this conversation. And I think it really creates an interesting and a good space to begin to think through what you do in your second section, the movement that you make from these debates around the post-nationalist turn, and space, and what we would consider as, you know, problematizing what this very concept of alternative, of which these spaces have been dubbed or conceptualized under. And I want to turn to Andrea, from your particular position as one who have whose work have really been about community upliftment, development, through your various arms within and kind of portfolios within the National Cultural Foundation, but also yourself as an art maker, and how, you know, this idea of space, if you want to begin. And certainly, Russell, I'm going to segue to you as well to take on this, but I wanted to begin with Andrea, if you will.
Okay. Oh, the making of a Caribbean avant-garde. First, let me commend you, Therese. It was a big task that you've taken on, and I think that you have done something that's very, very valuable to discussions that need to not only start with you, but continue and go on beyond the things that you have explored within the book. I do think it's a very timely publication. I gained from it a lot of very keen insight into the Caribbean's contemporary scene over the last 30 years. And I really think that, you know, the overview of development, both in pre and post-independence development in the sector in the various Caribbean territories, was particularly useful, very informative, critical inquiry into the sector. The examination of the various tensions that shape and continue to shape the sector, I found particularly instructive, both from the artist process of defining themselves, defining yourself, how naming yourself, and also being defined by others, and knowing that sometimes the result is very, very different, how artists see themselves and the development of their work, contemporary artists in particular, and then how their work is seen when it's taken outside of the region. Very engaging and quite entertainment in parts. My perspective is predominantly from an institutional role. Having worked as an arts administrator for the last 30 years and having experienced some of these things, but from the end of someone who's representing a government institution, I can understand and fully identify with the tensions between the government, which maybe are governmental institutions, which may be seen as a center by virtue of being established from the public purse, and then alternative space, the margins, the groups of artists and artistic initiatives like Fresh Milk and Alice Yard, whose work comes about as a result of their feeling that government isn't doing enough or isn't doing what needs to be done, and is maybe too caught up in an aesthetic of an earlier generation that might be considered no longer relevant. I do think that as an institution, our roles have to be research and support via publication, exhibitions, seeking of sponsorship, not only for our programs, but other community programs, and assisting with the development of international programs, as well as directly funding and supporting artist-led initiatives. My one criticism would be that often it seems within your writing that these are necessarily polar opposites, and I don't see it quite like that. An institution, for example, like the NCF, that's the one in which I've got the longest association, came about directly as a result of the agitation of the community, of the artistic community. It really has been, I would say, or is a modern day legacy of early initiatives such as Yoruba Yard, the People Arts Movement, and these are all movements that you yourself would have touched on in your publication. It was the Barbados' hosting of Carry Festa for the first time in 1981 that gave the final push and the impetus, whereby I would say developed the real political will to form an institution that would be responsible and charged with developing culture and artistic expression broadly and primarily at the community level. So I've always felt, and my experience has told me, that really the center and the margin in the context of such national cultural investment are directly related and inextricably tied. I again note in terms of the Brazil, there was a mention of the visiting of a group of Brazilian curators, and after hosting them in Barbados for a week or two, the one or the major takeaway was that they developed a partnership between Fresh Milk and a similar platform, private sector led, in Brazil, and artistic exchanges came about of that, very beneficial to the young Barbadian artists who took part. I guess some persons may have seen it that the government was won up by that success, but really I see that as a success of the program, which came about as part of the plan, really, because the hosting of these curators, and not just for that event, but other events, always include tours to private studios, independent arts initiatives, commercial galleries, etc. So part of the investment, I think, is understood. While government may seek to take the lead in certain initiatives, understandably can't get it right all the time, can't do it all on its own. And essentially the work and the initiatives that we undertake are entirely dependent on the support and the articulated needs of the wider community. So I would say my only difficulty with your review of the role of institutions is I don't agree that our work and our role is competitive at all, but indeed I think it's complementary. Admittedly, I will admit, our community doesn't always see it like that. The institution is often criticized for the way it spends its money, for the choices that it makes, for the overwhelming, I would say, amateur or less developed non-professional artists who often end up being profiled through many of our programs, and many of the programs indeed are developmental. And yes, professional artists rarely see their value because many of them have already been educated to a high level and are often circulating in networks that are possibly more effective for the profiling and showcasing of their work than many of the national initiatives. But I think it's important to note that, yes, institutions do have their role, and the role has to be seen, I think, as supportive and collaborative and not so much competitive. Stating that, I also need to say that, yeah, state institutions do need to be strengthened. Again, most of my experience is with the Barbadian National Arts-led institution, the National Cultural Foundation, but this is true for many other territories. Even when an institution is set up, it is often understaffed, underfunded, and the decisions that are taken with how the budget is spent are not always where one sector or another may decide that the priority is. And this is often the challenge. I think state institutions have a broad mandate, and it's impossible to adequately serve with the budget given all sectors of the arts community, the contemporary, the more traditional, the more commercial, and yet we are expected to lay a groundwork or create a framework for this to happen. I think artist initiatives are extremely vital, not only because they will foreground and keep on the front burner and keep in the nation's eye changes that are happening in the international sphere that will impact on our artists' ability to enter those circles, and do so more readily and more immediately than a government institution. Governmental institutions by their nature tend to be heavily bureaucratic, and therefore, though we move often slowly, we see the same challenge with Carifesta. And again, yes, we've seen, as your book has pointed out, some of our nation and the region's professional artists have withdrawn themselves from the festival because they believe it's a lot of money spent and not many takeaways from the artists. From my experience over the years, most of the artistic takeaways come in the informal parts of the festival. I would think that the success is creating the platform that brings so many artists together, but most of the takeaways, the contacts made, the exchanges, made the collaborations that follow up, often come not necessarily out of the formal program, but by the many informal spaces that that amount of activity actually brings. And yes, because it's not easy to measure, because it's often not on the governmental-led platforms, it's kind of hard to quantify. But in feedback, in follow-ups, in information shared by artists years after, it is that informal network that has been beneficial to them, more so even, or maybe because of its separateness and its apartness from the official formal program. I note your point regarding the importance of artistic-led initiatives having a selective focus. And I think, yes, having a selective focus, being, say, an arts representative body that is specifically interested at targeting, say, contemporary artists under the age of 35, will not only mean that their resources, however they attain them, are targeted at addressing and accomplishing their objective, which is their development, their exposure, and hopefully catapulting to a more global stage, is admirable, and it needs to continue. Unfortunately, governmental-led entities rarely have that option of being selective. And the justification is obviously the taxpayer-funded programs that we do, which is expected to be filtered to touch as many as possible, the base, the popular, and therefore, yes, the higher investment in popular forms like carnival and activities where there is a strong commercial generation, money generation. These tensions we deal with even internally, and the tensions of how the money is spent, where it is spent, where it's targeted, and how you balance the investment in things like festival that has a strong money-making focus, you know, the arts that pay as opposed to the arts that cost, and then the necessary investment for training, development, and exposure for our practitioners. So in review, I found it a very good read. The section 1, very thick on the critical theory. It is an academic document, and I think, yes, it gives a very good overview of critical frameworks from which these developments over the last 30 years in the Anglophone Caribbean can be framed. I like you do think, yes, it's going to be very valuable reading for young art students and art curators, but I think also art historians, curators generally, and even visual artists who might not define themselves, or might define themselves as contemporary, but are not in terms of avant-garde contemporary in the sector that you're really looking for, if only for an education, if only to build awareness of what really you're looking to do or you need to do as an artist in your art practice, if your work is going to get an audience outside of, you know, the narrow space of the island. I think it's also very valuable references for persons in arts administration around the region, because there's not a lot of very, very visible in a broad, popular way contemporary presentations, even by our artists via groups like Fresh Milk, who's doing some excellent work. They are talking to an audience that is really part of the fairly narrow network. They're speaking to an audience that wants to engage and wants to see the work that's being produced and facilitated by the artists who they facilitate and support there. But again, I think partly because of the nature of it, so very, very different from easily identifiable visual aesthetics of the wider community, the broader community rarely gets the opportunity to engage. And often, if they do, they dismiss it because they don't understand it. So this again calls for a greater strengthening of not only existing institutions that offer these sort of support governmentally, but also I think maybe a strengthening of our educational platform. I think from secondary school, art education and higher, we're fortunate that at this point in time, we have the community college that's offering a BFA program. We have the Barbados Center for Creative Imagination that's offering higher studies in the arts. But 30 years ago, we didn't have that. 30 years ago, and so we're at a point where we're already creating a greater professional class of artists, but the broadening of understanding and viewership and engagement with these forms of expression still hasn't caught up, or I would say school's art syllabus has not caught up. So that's one of the takeaways, is that, yeah, we need to invest, our government needs to invest in strengthening the educational scope of the programs, I think at least at the secondary level. So again, lastly, my takeaway, I think there are some very, very, very revealing statements made in terms of understanding how our practice, even the highly contemporary practice within our space, is seen very differently. It's seen, as you said, belatedly often when transposed to a metropolitan setting. So that sort of engagement and discussion and opportunities for our artists to visit, to see other works and to see how their work can be best, I guess, curated and presented in that context is necessary. But I also ask, I think that while this sort of global recognition of our artists is desirable, I think, and most of our artists want that, I also have to ask, is it enough though that we should be working only for that recognition? Don't our artists have a responsibility of seeking to engage their communities first, their immediate communities, their nation community, their Caribbean community, in the sort of discussions and points and issues that they wish to bring to the fore? I note very instructively in your review of some of the initiatives around the region, CCA 7, that when they folded after 10 years, they noted they were awash with international funding, but they could not get the matching local funding, which is instructive. I think most of our arts initiatives would love to be able to say that they are awash in international funding. So it means that even if that funding is successfully sourced, the project is not sustainable unless we get them to be somehow more embedded in national initiatives and, I guess, wedded to a national plan, even if the plan is to facilitate these independent voices and independent spaces. So that is it for me. An enjoyable read. I read the first section, I thought was a little thick, but generally very enjoyable and even humorous in some points. Hugh Locke's giant voodoo doll, I thought that one had me bust out laughing. I thought that was a great comparison, and I understood it right away. So that's it for me. I really enjoyed the read. Therese, well done.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Quite a lot there. And I think it actually creates a nice space to, of course, Therese, feel free to interject, but I think it creates a nice space to invite Russell to share some thoughts, because in a sense, Russell's career actually kind of spans the two polarities, in a sense, that you're speaking of, from two very different disciplines, if you will. From an earlier theater arts career and then moving into the visual and into new media. And you could kind of map this trajectory in the scope of his art making and production, and even within the positionalities of being within the region, working in other spaces in the region, but also internationally in New York and in Chicago. So if I may, I would turn to Russell, unless you want to interject at this moment, Therese. Is it? Oh, you're muted still, love.
Sorry, no, go ahead. Let Russell speak, and then I can.
All right, because I also want to leave room for the audience. So again, please, audience, feel free as the questions come, because you know, feel free to leave them in the chat, and I'll be able to allow the panelists to field them. So as they come, feel free to leave them in the chat. But over to you, Russ.
Okay.
And your takeaways and all of it.
Hi, Therese. Congratulations on the publication, and I have to say thank you for this work. You know, I think it is it offers up a way to structure a lot of the debates and conversations that we've been having in our community about, you know, what we're seeing and feeling as an ideological transition that is affecting policy and affecting practice. So I think it's going to go a long way in putting a finer point on that, not only out in the community, but also in the classroom. I have to say, like Petrina, as I read it, I was like, you know, it led me to a great deal of self-reflection. Because like Yanique said, is that, you know, the eras that you're discussing are intimately woven into my experience. And from the beginning, I recognized that, you know, the way in which my trajectory was moving was going to keep me constantly between worlds, you know, even though I had an interest in theater from the time I landed at what was then the Cultural Training Center. I was all over the dance school, all over the art school, all over the music school. So I was always between practices. I caught on very early that there was another aspect to this thing that we do called art making that wasn't about the gallery and the theater stage and concert stage, that there was this aspect of it that was about the sacred and the private, right? So I found my interest in developing my approach to the work between worlds again, between a kind of secular requirement and a sacred responsibility, between class, you know. I grew up in the 80s, so the effects of Reaganomics and Thatcherism was very visible to my experience, and also between ideology, you know. I think, as you have defined here, you know, between a sense of the responsibility towards a nationalist agenda and an allegiance to the personal, right? The thing about self that is not tethered to that what can very realistically be named as restrictive, right? And it's interesting that as I was going through all of this and I was jumping between Jamaica and the United States, that I did come home and I came into Zamicon, and that's the first time I met you. And I had already started to dip my toe into the media world, and the exhibition that was up, I was like shocked, you know, because I had not seen work like that on the wall in Barbados, either having been acknowledged with a full exhibition by one artist, or even one piece in a group show. And it was a one-man show, and it was abstract, it was media based. The color spectrum was, you know, really synthetic. And I was like, oh, so this actually is starting to move here. But I was gone in that decade. And so in reading the book and recognizing that, you know, the decade that Zamicon was active, if I'm understanding your timeline correctly, was really at the kind of zenith point of that transition. I'm wondering if, you know, when you were there and you're just going about the business of hanging shows and dealing with artists and all of that, if you were aware of the larger kind of complexity of the environment that you were in. That's my first question.
I think that Semicon stepped into that era just as it was declining, it had already reached its zenith, and it was already in decline when I stepped into it and tried to do what I was doing. And in a way, I think, you know, there were a couple of years where there was still the same kind of energy around the art scene as it was then. And then one started to sense a kind of gradual decline. And that there was a sense of confusion amongst many of the artists that I was dealing with. It was very painful to watch at times artists who had invested themselves fully in bringing about an exhibition that was then met with glaring indifference. And there was this sense that, okay, you know, maybe my time is over. I mean, what is going on here? And this was, you know, sometimes before people had actually, as I said in my introduction, you know, before they had actually really, you know, reached what for them would have been the pinnacle of their careers. I wasn't really, you know, I wasn't fully aware or even remotely aware of the broader sea change that was going on. And I mean, that is what I, you know, tried to establish when I went back to school. One also felt that in the surrounding community, there was a declining support. It was as though there was a generation of supporters, which was essentially dying out. And sometimes I mean that quite literally. You know, there was a generation there of people who, and people who were also very invested in the idea of a public sphere. And I'm not sure. Now I'm so removed from the market now. I don't know if a new generation has stepped into those shoes, but I suspect not. But I mean, speaking under correction. But yes, that was in response to your question.
So, you know, I think that issue of, you know, kind of having a public engagement as an artist, and, you know, you do a solo show and nothing sells, or there's no kind of public critical response to it or acknowledgement, was one of the things that kind of led me away from Barbados to Jamaica. I chose to go to Jamaica and not, you know, the metropolitan world, the States or the UK or Europe or anything like that, because what I was aware of is that the environment for artists in Jamaica was very different from what it is in Barbados, right? Is that the ecosystem that they were in between critics, collectors, the intellectual and academic community's engagement with art of all genres was very different. You know, I mean, the presence, I think, of Rex Nettleford in that space would have, you know, created a very tangible connection between a very high intellectual practice and an art practice. So I went to Jamaica, and what I discovered was that the way in which art functioned there was very, very, very different. And I think this is what I think Petrina's response to the book is illustrating. And it's noticeable that Jamaica is not one of the sites that you really dwell on in your book, even though it is English speaking, is that Barbados has that peculiarity of, you know, this is, you know, one of the things that I heard very early on, a quote from Kamal Brathwaite in one of his first commissioned surveys of art in Barbados, that Barbados was a Philistine society, is that there was almost a tangible aversion to the presence of art and its possibility. And I think also one of the things to keep in perspective about this reticence to engage with politics or any sort of disruptive statement is the fact that we have very close to us in our independence history an era in which artists were routinely murdered and maligned, and that's very close. Even though, you know, we may not have a kind of tangible relationship with it, that sentiment in the society of the possibility of persecution if you speak aloud is very, very real. I mean, I think when I went to the Cultural Training Center in Jamaica, it was very palpable. I went there maybe just shy of a decade after their political regime had changed, and all of the heavy hitters at that institution had evaporated. Not only had they evaporated, all remnants of their work had evaporated. There was very little archive visible there. And so that sense of the artist as political activists, I think, has been sublimated by that, as well as, and I think this is what you point to in your book, a reorientation of institutional relationship to the statements of art. So in our own scenario, the shift away from what is called social commentary towards party music, for example, and where the funding for that comes from, interestingly enough, largely out of the private sector, the alcohol companies, the telecom companies, and so on. So much so that, any sort of national agenda, debatable in its value as it may be, is sidelined by this private sector agenda, which has no real kind of sense of civic responsibility other than its slogan. There's a lot to unpack here, Therese. I think the last question I'm going to ask you is that there is an absence of a focus on the relevance or position of the sacred in the Caribbean art practice. And I'm wondering why you chose to go in that direction, even though, especially with the faculty that you were in, where there is such a clear opportunity to dig more deeply into that area.
Yeah, that is one of the many omissions that I think I can be charged with, and and I think the answer to that is that I didn't actually approach this with any intention of covering the full thematic range. I was more interested in contextualizing what informs the choice of form, that not so much form. What is it that motivates an artist to embrace a kind of deconstructive conceptualism? What is it that motivates an artist to produce something that's public or interactive? What is it that informs the focus on, or the embrace and adaptation of elements of the popular? And I think I'm very, very fleetingly mentioned the sacred in that context, but it doesn't appear as a theme in its own right. Nor does the theme of Black art in and of itself. It appears as discussed as a broader diasporic formation, but it's not a focal point. And I acknowledge that there are so many things that could have been taken up but which I think would probably require a book, a dedicated book. As, by the way, would the Jamaican art scene, which you are exactly right. I did not use Jamaica as a case study, partly because of the inherent and long-standing complexity of the Jamaican art scene, which is, for want of a better word, notorious. But also because the smaller islands satisfied my need for engaging with a space where there is an almost non-existing institution, as in Barbados, and where there's a very dormant institution, as in Trinidad, and where there's a young and relatively vibrant institution, as in the Bahamas. And to create a kind of a framework for analyzing how, in those respective situations, you find the dynamic between the institution and the alternative scene. Yes.
I think, for me, that, this book, what it does is that, if this stands as a singular kind of critical analysis of the art scene in the Lesser Antilles for more than 5 years, I'll be extraordinarily disappointed, because it does require a broadening of scope, not only in terms of that issue of seeing the sacred, but also in really questioning a more deeply reflexive issue of the function of art, right? What is art for? Because I think the kind of art that you're talking about in this book, and the kind of institutional framework in which that particular kind of art exists, is really one, as Andrea put it, very small, narrow element in the spectrum of expressive practices in this space. And that, I think that's this specifying of this particular institutional relationship to the practice of creativity is what is valuable here, is that it names it and identifies it as a specific thing, and not art in its kind of broad umbrella sense. So I think that maybe is my last question for you, is that, you know, in your building of Zemicon and that experience over that decade, and I know because you are an academic and you are a historian and you are a philosophical reflexive thinker, that I'm sure the question of the function of this commodity in the society would have come up. And I'm wondering where you land with that. How do you see this particular kind of art and the institution it engenders as being a function in the society? What is its use?
Well, that's a big question, Russell. I think that, in fact, I think that a lot of the movements that we've seen in the last few decades have reflected a deep sense of a legitimacy crisis in the arts, because it was pretty clear in the anti-colonial movement, you know, across the world, not just in the Caribbean, artists were aligned with political forces. And as soon as you come into independence and some things start to go awry, you know, they split up. And then, you know, you have to position yourself. You know, do you want your practice to be affirmative? Do you want it to be critical? And so you see that there's the question of autonomy, which I think I deal with at some length, maybe a tedium as well. You know, artists are forced to choose whether they want to perpetuate a kind of critical autonomy or a cultural autonomy. I think that I think that informs what they think their artist is going to do, whether it's going to be something that uplifts and embraces and gives visibility to people, or if it's going to be something that takes a sort of relative outsider, a marginal position in society and observes and critiques and is in a adopts a rude boy tongue, as I think has been Chris Kosier's default position. But it boils down to a question of what is your overarching intention, and I don't think that many artists are very clear on that. And one of the things I, in a very small way, hope the book will at least spark is some further thoughts about and discussions about where is it we want art to go at this point, and what is it we want to avoid, perhaps. And if I may, I just want to, in response to a few things Andrea pointed out, and I very much appreciate both of your assessments, and I wish I could start writing the book over again with taking all of this and putting it into the book as well. But I very much hope that no younger artist would ever pick this book up and read it as a prescription for what you are supposed to do if you want to make it in a biggie. For one thing, what I wanted to do was to tease out some of the trade-offs that are made in the process of becoming visible. And secondly, I'm absolutely certain that the minute somebody puts this on a formula and you try and show it in New York, they're immediately going to say, oh, this is old hat. So that's not even a game that I think anybody should try to play. I'm not in the least interested in trying to figure out what the formula is. Now, and I also just wanted to say that I did not actually mean to suggest that that there's a directly oppositional dynamic, at least not, maybe in Jamaica, but not in, certainly not in Barbados, between the institution and the arts community. In fact, I think I say quite explicitly that the arts community is, their critical attitude is aimed at the absence of an art institution, and rather aimed at cultural policy than at institutional practices. I think that the resentment is towards a policy that has increasingly come to see the arts as a kind of cow that government can milk, without offering it it's sort of the head start that it needs to even get off the ground. So I agree with you that I absolutely think that the alternative spaces are doing a wonderful job, and that they're extremely important, and that they, I think I say somewhere that they, you know, they do the nation proud by doing what they do so well. But alternative spaces are not accountable, nor do they have to be. That's not in their remit, you know. It's so they cannot take the place of institutions, which is effectively what they come to do when the institutions are too weak to be funded to do their jobs, you know, as it should be done. And this is not a critique of any cultural officers or anything, which, you know, and I have a word of respect for many of my friends in you know, institutional capacities. So yeah, I mean, in the scenario where institutions are failing or non-existent, what we need is perhaps a plurality of alternative spaces, so that they don't become proxy institutions in their own right, because then we have a problem.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you for this. Thank you so much, Therese. And I'm wondering if there's any comments or questions from those assembled, if there anything that triggered a thought and you wanted to share. We're into that segment of our evening before we wrap up, where we just really want to hear your voices. There are many artists, art brokers and collectors, institution persons in this on this platform with us. So if there's anything you wish to share at this point, please feel free. And while you're thinking of your question, I was just curious, Therese, to kind of the last movement in the book in terms of exploring the space of the metropole and the definitions of Caribbeanness. And I think the book in all, while we are focusing on the visual arts, has incredible implications for looking at art practice generally, and also looking at knowledge production generally. And in terms of, one might even position it as a crisis of criticism, and where that criticism of cultural criticism and where it is lodged, like where it is positioned. And I think, for example, of the case of the CSA for the first time since its inception, moving to hold its conference in the US, and all of the conversations that happened about, and the CSA being the Caribbean Studies Association, which was committed, in terms of to meet in the region and move across the Caribbean and its broader circum-Caribbean feel, and this kind of move to a meeting in the US, and what that stirred up in terms of where is the Caribbean and what is the Caribbean, and what is, from what position is one legitimately able to intervene in conversations. And I think the latter part of the text really brings that to the fore, and it has broader implications in terms of those who choose to act and to create and to critique from the positionalities of the so-called peripheries and have that be the space of their center. So I wasn't sure if you just wanted to speak about that moment in terms of these major exhibitions and the ways in which there's a sense that Caribbean arts is, and the kind of definition of the Caribbean is a moving signifier in a certain way, where it's become in the last, I don't want to put maybe 3-4 decades. I mean, you could correct me in terms of the position of the diaspora being, quote unquote, the more legitimate Caribbean than the actual region itself. So I'm not sure if you wanted to comment on that, or anyone on the panel for that matter. And I will, open it out to you, Petrina, who has been in this situation where you've been curating shows and commenting and writing on shows that are on Caribbean art staged in the US or staged in Europe or in the UK. And what are those kind of, questions and implications that raises in terms of how we view ourselves and the center of our criticism? I hope it wasn't too unwieldy. Yeah, understanding. Yeah,
and off the cuff, and I can see that a question has emerged in the chat, but I think that one of the goodness, I had a very clear response to. I think that the question of so the whole diaspora question is central to what you're talking about, because it sort of broadens the space that can claim to be Caribbean, and so if I find that movement in some ways quite problematic, it is not just it is certainly not to exclude people who feel that they are Caribbean but happen to be living in Paris or London or Toronto. It is because of the institutional support systems that they can lean on, which are not usually given to Caribbean artists. And so therefore there's a tendency to reproduce global hierarchies even within this formation. And if we are going to use a diaspora concept, it has to be with all the nuances acknowledged in terms of what are the options for people to move and to become mobile, which is what this concept seems to suggest, and also to acknowledge that there is a certain ideas and certain people are much more mobile than others, right? So this idea of free mobility and circulation of ideas and personnel is absolute nonsense. So yes, it is yes, the Caribbean is blessed with numerous brilliant academics and writers who speak to the Caribbean from a deep felt perspective. But there are also people located in the Caribbean who have as much to say, and who may not be afforded the same kind of institutional support to get that message out. So, thank you.
There's a question in the chat.
Dennis, you can, if you want to, I could read it out, or you could raise it yourself, or what feels comfortable. Well, Dennis Dacres is saying that Dr. Hadchity does not mention the role of the private commercial gallery in her book. Does she feel that there's a role for the private sector to play in the advancement of art in the Caribbean? And if so, what might that role be?
Well, as much as I advocate the doubling of alternative spaces, obviously there is a role for the private sector to I mean, I think, and in some places, in Jamaica and Trinidad included, the private sector has done a lot to promote the visual arts. I have absolutely no reservations about that. The problem is for those artists who do not find commercial support or private sector support for whatever reason, to rise to the surface as well. So I think the question, I'd rather flip the question and say, you know, what should be the role of institutions and alternative spaces to supplement, you know, whatever the private sector may be doing, and to equalize and to fulfill their broadly representative mandate. And Andrea, I have no problem at all with an institution like the NCF, you know, seeking out the shall we say, the not so sexy expressions in that are, you know, that exist in the arts community, and which have audiences, and very often, I think, have very valid messages to convey, but which find absolutely no interest or representation in the, you know, in the, you know, amongst the arbiters that are working now.
Thank you. Russell, I know you had a couple of other questions. If there isn't anyone coming in just yet, feel free, Russ, to ask.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on, you know, this question of new media, and how you're looking at artists who are dealing with new media as making that choice specifically to appeal to this international market. And there, you know, in that section where you were talking about, you know, what out of that particular experience, the artist's takeaway was that these are the strategies to employ if you want to make it, right? So there was this genre space, this medium, but there was also this question of engaging with subjectivity, hybridity, institutional critique, right? And I think in many ways is like this is an unavoidable, right? For my one part, as a child, I grew up reading Marvel comic books and watching cheap American sitcoms. Like that's what I grew up on, right? So as a cultural reality, when we think about hybridity, that is woven into the fabric of our childhood experiences across the board. We continue to be educated in English. All of our state religions continue to be of European origin, and so on. And I think about that necessity of trying to find some sort of individual sensibility within that cultural swirl and its relationship to media significant. Not only because we got caught up in, and I think you mentioned it in the book, you know, this idea that the politics of representation evolved of its own accord, right? So this idea that the liberalization of the ability to represent because of how digital tools evolved is something that we were not in control of. All of a sudden, everybody had a full production studio in their pocket. Something was going to happen. And then I also point to the fact that, you know, the genesis of things like performance art and video art do come out of an anti-institutional space to begin with, an anti-establishment space. So I find it was like, you know, for me personally, moving into digital media, of course, at the time I wasn't thinking about it in that way. And I, you know, when I started, we were still in dark rooms and things like that. But I was at a confluence of moments where, you know, my decision to pursue media was almost without any import from me. You know, it was an obvious follow through. So I'm wondering, in the matrix that you're seeing, do you see any legitimacy in this particular approach to art making within this context? Experimental video, performance art, these kind of non-material approaches.
Yes, no, let it never be said that I want all artists to revert to painting and sculpture. That is, you know, that would never be my position. What I'm saying is that when this media, not when they were first used, but when they first were used by people who really were able to be seen to be pushing the envelope, it was, I think, a way for that at that moment to signal a departure from what had happened before. It was a way of inserting themselves and asserting themselves as the next generation. And that's because there were examples of installation being used, for instance, in ways quite well fit into a sort of nationalist, ethos. But at some point, it starts becoming the media for becoming seen as being avant-garde. And so now, but I don't think it is necessarily the medium as much as the message that changes. I mean, of which the change matters. And I think you are so young, Russell, that when you when you feel that it was sort of handed to you and you could embrace it unreflectively, it's because you were not necessarily part of that initial moment. It was already something that had been established and circulated when you found yourself in the arts community and wanting to make something, to make art. And it wasn't necessary for you to question whether it was, legitimate or because that had already somehow it had become mainstream at that point. But there is a point in the catalog for that exhibition, which went to Spain, Caribe Insular, where the curators quite explicitly, and I think very revealingly, say in their catalog text that that they do not, although they want to be broadly representative and open to every form of expression, they still want to limit painting and sculpture because that is too commercial, right? And what they then silence is the fact that there's another kind of currency in which you trade when you do installation and new media art and so on. And that is equally that's another form of capital. And so I think it's not that, it clearly, I mean, installation and performances are not commercial media, but they do, but you can trade in them in other ways. And I just want to point out that, some of the, it's the dynamic, the overall dynamic that I'm trying to describe is tied and supported by a general turn to new media.
There's a question from Guess saying that certain people are much more mobile than others. There are people situated in the Caribbean who are not afforded institutional support to be more mobile. Quote, isn't the problem rather that nationality as an institution traps these people in geographic boundaries? Neoliberalism doesn't go far enough. The EU for freedom, conferring freedom of movement of people hand in hand with free movement of goods and services, is a rare counterexample in the world. Do you have any comments or responses to that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very current line of thought. The nation state as a construct is certainly, the critique of it is what underpins a lot of current movements. I know that many people would adopt the view that you're flagging here, but I think, although this is tied to I think a much broader political discussion, that for all its faults, I think the nation state with its institutions is perhaps the only resistance that unprivileged people, and this may sound ironic, but I think that the institutions that can be ultimately held accountable, although sometimes very unsuccessfully, is still a better option than the absolute jungle law of a globalized world where everyone fends for themselves without national institutions to provide some kind of legal framework for the protection of people. But this is I think a sensitive and very broad and important question. So thank you for that. I think it would probably be on a lot of people's minds.
Yes, indeed. I want to also take this moment to acknowledge the various artists on this platform this evening, and really would ask a general question, and anyone could pop in and speak. I recognize Heather John Scott, Camille Sheda, Philip Thomas. There's, Esther Phillip and Adrian Green. There's just so many here. I've noticed that Anika Small is no longer with us, and I wanted to ask her a question about Golden Square and the curatorial practice around that. But some of the question, a question that could be guiding, and many students in the room as well. Thank you for that reminder, Russell. But I was just kind of thinking for students and for those who are actively engaged in their art practice, where do you see yourselves, even in terms of contextualizing this idea of a kind of post-nationalist contemporary and the work of the avant-garde now? So one of the questions I had for Therese, but certainly I want to open it out to the artists in the room, is this idea of what for you do you see as the imperatives of the now? What would be animating your art practice in the now? And if you were to have a kind of futurist projection, the kind of labor that you see yourself pursuing, seeing that, where are we going beyond the nation? We've seen a kind of younger, daring a set of art making practices coming to the fore. But I'm wondering what is that thorn in your side that is animating your work currently, or your curatorial practice, or your art making practice? And this I'm really, and if you could link it to any of what was being discussed on this panel, feel free. But really, I wanted to give you a space to reflect on that, and that's for anybody who wants to chime in at this time. And again, welcome to all of you here who've stayed as well. It's like, you want the work to do the speaking for you, but in the absence of the work to be able to look at currently, your voice is most welcomed. Well,
I'll speak. So not only as an artist, but as a teacher, because I have a responsibility of guiding a lot of young artists. One of the things that keeps coming up as a theme is vulnerability, both in a personal way, but also in a way that embraces the largesse of our problem in the Caribbean, which is environmental vulnerability and economic vulnerability. That has been a theme for me for a little bit of time now, and so seeing that the students are tapping into it and picking up on it, even if they're not naming it as such, I think they're recognizing it, and I think this is a big part of what is driving the sentiment away from a nationalist orientation, is that there is a sense that the state is not acknowledging that vulnerability in a way that produces a sense of security. So the way of dealing with that vulnerability, or addressing it, or expressing it, almost automatically demands that you, if not actively accuse the state of leaving one in such a situation, you recognize a sense of apathy in allowing for that situation to occur, whether that is, as I said, economic, environmental, or personal.
indeed. Precarity offers, for sure. Anyone else? I know some of the kind of the pull for some of our dances in the region, and I say region in its largest context here, have really been pushed to think through this idea of precarity and specifically looking to do more site-specific work that could be, in a sense, engaging with the historical, but certainly engaging with the current vulnerabilities of environment, of memory, and really, speaking and working from a deep-seated multi or interdisciplinarity in their practice as they are trying to engage some of the what they see as the urgency of this moment and the precariousness of this moment as well. Anyone else? No. All right. Well,
No, I have just one question. Whether the publishers are making any effort to have the book distributed to university reading lists, or Therese, whether you yourself have been able to introduce this possibly at the Barbados Community College so that it can be hopefully referenced in the studies of the students in the BFA program there. What's that possibilities, and what have you been able to explore, if anything?
Yes, I mean the book is available as far as I know in the library at UE, in the bookshop, as well as in the museum's bookshop. The publishers, I suppose, make their own efforts. It's available on Amazon, also as an electronic book.
so this is what it looks like. Sorry, my notes are all as my copy. But I see that Professor Kamgisha, Erin Kamgisha, is in the audience, and we were doing this conversation, in a sense, in partnership with the other Universal's Transnational Consortium, which is a consortium charged with theorizing from post-colonial locations on politics and aesthetics. So I was wondering if, Erin, if you wanted to speak. Welcome, we miss you. So I see that you might manage to pop in. I don't know if you're still here, but you were.
There's a question from Philip Thomas.
Okay, yeah. Great. Because there was also a sense in terms of to get to Erin to speak about distribution and the work that does in terms of reaching other audiences broadly. And then I will definitely get to Philip after Erin's comments.
Well, I was lamentably absent for practically the whole of the launch. I just joined about 10 or 15 minutes ago. I was in a departmental meeting and then had to walk across in the snow in snowy and cold Massachusetts. But it's wonderful to see the launch. It's wonderful that other Universals could have played a small part in the sponsoring of this event. The Other Universals Consortium, in brief, was founded in 2017, and it's a consortium of which University of the West Indies is one of the member universities. It also consists of University of Western Cape, which is the lead university, University of Johannesburg, University of Wits, University of Cape Town, University of Addis Ababa, and University of Ghana Legon, and the American University of Beirut. So there are a number of member universities. We work on theorizing questions surrounding the Global South. We've been doing a number of events, and we are very thrilled to be involved in the launch of Therese's work. Therese, who I believe is the first PhD candidate, a successful PhD in cultural studies to have published a single authored book. So thank you so much, Therese. Congratulations. And I'm glad to be here, if even just for the last concluding few minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Erin.
Thanks. So I see Philip Thomas has raised a question about, is our post-nationalist sentiment born of a concept of state failure, or is it born of a desire to migrate? And then coming up after that, Dr. Demerson, we've been talking a lot this week with the UE dance students about national, unnational representation, who, quote unquote, gets to be abstract, make abstract work and methods to explore vulnerability in the personal and political context. So it's nice to hear about parallels in the visual arts. So certainly. So do you wish to address any, the first question and then the comment?
I think that Philip Thomas is exactly right, that, you know, the post-nationalist momentum is certainly born out of a critique and a desperation and frustration with the failures of the post-colonial state, which of course are not unique to the Caribbean or even to the post-colonial world, but nonetheless, there certainly is, I think, a disappointment and on the part of artists, an intense frustration with the fact that they have really been left behind. And I would say maybe, well, I guess every art form feels the same way, but visual artists, I think, feel especially overlooked. And so I think that the desire to migrate is part of the same frustration. And I think that post-nationalist momentum certainly springs from that point. One may speculate, but I am not, I certainly can't say that is necessarily a motivating factor, but there are ways of making oneself visible by taking counter-hegemonic positions. And in an academic context, of course, there may be, a post-nationalist stance might be, a pathway to some kind of visibility. And I do think, I mean, certainly, I think I say, but I feel that I haven't really made enough of this. But I think that the critique of the nation state is absolutely central and hugely important. And so I certainly did not mean to signal that I think that a critical nationalism is a wrong step. I think this is a tradition that started already in the 80s, so yeah. But the outright post-nationalist tendency, I think, is generally born out of that frustration. I also just wanted to add, and unfortunately my screen has gone completely blank, so I can't see anything any longer. I don't know what's going on. But I think that
wiggle the mouse.
Yeah. Okay. Now it's.
Maybe while it's happening, I would actually love to hear from some of the artists. So to throw it on Philip, how do you see the work that you do today, and do you consider the work that you do post-nationalist in any way? Because you also seem, with the series of exhibitions that you have been doing with Camille and other artists, there is very much a kind of an institutional investment in a certain way to support young artists. So I'm curious as to how you see the work that you do.
It is a very interesting question, because one of the things that, as many of you know, the pandemic has in a way gutted art economies all across the world. And so it isn't a matter simply of wanting to be nationalist or not. Many of us were forced to be against a lot of their will. But me personally, as you know, I've had all the opportunities to be everywhere else, but decided to settle here in Jamaica at home and function from here. I don't necessarily want to say that position is something that should be practiced by every artist. That's not what I'm saying. And this alludes to my first question, which is, your sense of nationalism or post-nationalism cannot be born purely out of frustration, right? Because that will in turn lead to a kind of mass migration that, one, doesn't fix the problem, and two, the West that so many of us are sort of running towards are engaging in their own nationalism. So if you're trying to escape one form of nationalism or failed nationalism into another kind of nationalism, and one that's even less beneficial to you coming from the Caribbean, then you find yourself, as people say, between the devil and the deep blue sea. So there has to be a situation whereby artists understand their civic responsibility in the countries that they're from. as opposed to simply trying to make individual careers out there in the world. That is good and great. And you can't necessarily criticize any artist for that. But part of the reason why we don't have a lot in the Caribbean is primarily because of this constant seeking of individual success, as opposed to creating a kind of national state success, whereby we can continuously produce artists at the same amount of rate. We can get the same sort of state funding. We can create the same sort of synergy, even between the islands, where we don't necessarily have to constantly be at other people's doors knocking, trying to get in. And so that's one aspect of the problem I think that we're struggling with. And so many of us in the Caribbean as individual artists have figured out ways to secure individual success. But how do you then translate that back home in order to create a kind of a revolving door and create that right here in your own country?
Sorry, Philip. Sorry, dear. You're fading. So if you could pose that question again, but a little louder, because you're starting to fade a bit. And
Right.
you're asking an important question.
Yes. How is it that how will artists be able to, one, secure whatever individual success that they want to? And you can't criticize anybody for wanting to do that. But two, how do you then translate that particular individual success to your own country and allow for a certain kind of synergy that will create the revolving door of aesthetic development where you're from? For instance, if we take a lot of the earlier pioneers that had all the same opportunities to be elsewhere in the world, but created the Edna Manley College or created the National Gallery, then this whole generation that we're celebrating wouldn't even exist if people hadn't made the sacrifice to create their own state resources, let's say. So these are some of the really pressing questions that I find are difficult to answer. One, I'm not proposing that I have the answer to it in any way, shape, or form. But if the pandemic taught us one thing, it taught us that we have to figure out ways to function in our own countries.
Can I put in a quick response to that? So there is a thing about the romanticizing of the independence era in the Caribbean and the sacrifices that people made and the kind of altruism of their nationalism that I think this moment of post-nationalism is trying to pick apart, right? And there's something very necessary for us in that process to grow as a society, is that our nationalism kind of failed, and we need to say so. The other thing is that to identify oneself as nationalist with regard to your work, and in an institutional sense, if you receive money from the state to make your work, you are duty bound, therefore, to not be critical of the state because they're paying your bills. This is a dangerous place for us to be. If artists are bound to a scenario in which critical analysis of the state is not part of their palette. And I mentioned this because it was sobering for me last year when a group of artists were publicly chastised and they're threatened with defunding because they had received money from the state, but the sentiments that they were expressing were inconsistent with the identity of the country that the state wanted to project. In this case, it was not something that was actively anti the political party that was currently in place. It was more lascivious, right? It was like gun tunes or girl tunes. And the state was like, no, we're not about that. That is not the Barbados that we're projecting to the world and so on. But in my mind, I was like, oh, but that position can easily translate over to if somebody makes a statement that is against a particular policy or action of a government official or government entity. If that mechanism is put in place where state funding is rescinded based on the artist's statement. There's some of us in the community have taken the position that we don't really want state money unless it is in a commercial modality. And what that does is saves us the trouble of having to refine our statement or bend what we're trying to say to suit, right? So I just wanted to kind of throw that in, is that there is a responsibility to remain critical of the state in the same way that a generation behind us took on the responsibility of being critical against the colonial state.
I mean, the generation in front of us, no? Or behind, okay, the generation right behind us, I got it, yeah. Mm-hmm.
But I respond quickly, because, and I completely understand what you're saying. If you're beholden to the state, then it really ties your hand in creating the sort of work that's relevant in terms of criticizing the state. But I will hasten to say that there is another kind of statecraft that is not as pernicious in the international market, that in a way isn't as direct in monetizing this or that kind of art. And so I heard a discussion earlier on when it was being mentioned that certain kinds of works, i.e. New media art, carries a certain preferential response to other kinds of traditional modes of making art. That, in a way, is a state imperative. It may not be as heavy-handed, let's say, as earlier ways in which the state would give funding for artists, but it is for sure a kind of incentivizing of silencing certain kinds of ways of making art, as opposed to other kinds of ways of making art. And you cannot necessarily claim free discourse if there's an incentive embedded in the reception of the work, right? So that's one thing I wanted to say, that there are different kinds of state support, and some may be far more pernicious than others. So I understand exactly what you're saying, perfectly fine, but we also, I think, have to understand that it's the same so-called failed state that we're coming from is part and parcel of the fetishization of the things that so many artists are being included in the other states that we're running. You see, that's one of the difficulties I'm having, where there's a certain kind of way in which we've fetishized Caribbean life, and how that then becomes a kind of catalyst for us to engage into other markets. We have to also be sensitive about the sort of imagery of ourselves that we're putting in the world. So that's a serious double-edged sword that I think.
I think that complexity is what is most valuable about this book, is that what it is attempting to articulate is how the mechanism of monetizing Caribbean fetish has in fact not changed. It's just the patina on it, or the facade of it. So whereas we would have fetishized the tropical, now what we fetishize is a kind of, articulate critique of the failed state in these, modern modes, right? So that idea that the Caribbean artist is an artist who expresses the failure of modernity, that itself, that idea becomes fetishized. And this is one of the things that you just said, Therese, is that it's not so much about the fact of the medium of video art or performance, but it really is about the statement that those forms are carrying right now. Yeah.
Yeah, I also think there is a real danger in declaring the whole Caribbean as a bunch of failed states. I mean, whose interest does that serve? I mean, there are failed states in the world, but we don't live in one of them. We live in a hugely under-resourced state. I think that it's too easy to just write off, the relative achievements of Caribbean statecraft as well. And I think really rather well-functioning critical sector that is also trying to hold the state accountable. But clearly, I think the Caribbean nation state certainly has a lot to learn, and especially in terms of listening and not just penalizing artists. I mean, that is a ridiculous and self-defeating response. I think that a lot could be done to harmonize the relationship between the state and its artists. And I think the burden of that momentum has to be on the state. But I don't think we should fall into the trap of just writing. I mean, we enjoy relatively free access to education and healthcare. You know, that's not nothing. We also live in a region where, you know, we are under, you know, constant scrutiny from North America and others. So, you know, within I think we can certainly scrutinize our politicians and condemn many of them. But I think that there is also a way of understanding the relatively limited operative freedom that they sometimes have. This is not to defend the indefensible.
Indeed. Well, cognizant of the time and that we're going through your period of perhaps dinner or supper, I see Yanique, do you want to say something? Sure. Before I just saw your camera come up. Okay, no problem. She's just saying hi to everyone. All right. What I want to do now is just closing, just any kind of closing words as we wrap up what I believe to be a really provocative session and one that is long overdue. But before we have those final thoughts, I just want to alert you to a series that will be up and running in March from the Faculty of Culture, Creative and Performing Arts, Department of Cultural Studies. We will be launching a series called Artists Talking to Artists, which will be spearheaded and moderated by Dr. Therese Hadchity, engaging artists in a kind of dialogue with their work as well. And that would kind of run on an every other week basis in the month of March. And so look out for the flyer. I'll be sure to send it out, and it would be lovely to have you on the platform again, engaging and speaking and sharing and learning and sharing space with one another. And indeed, yes, thank you, Philip, and for your interventions, and everyone who has spoken so far and have made important comments and interventions. And for those who've just been absorbing, your presence here is most appreciative. So I turn back to the panel. Any last thoughts, and then we'll close off, and you could proceed with the rest of your evening. So any last thoughts? Andrea, I'll start with you, and then we'll go through.
Just want to thank you, Therese, for your hard work in completing this book and getting it published and contributing it to the conversation. I'm looking forward to volume 2. But well done, well done.
Thank you very much.
I think, thank you also to Therese and Yanique for organizing this. And I think what is interesting is the conversation highlighted the very complicated networks and complicated kind of layers of understanding Caribbean art. And I think the book, The Making of the Caribbean Avant-Garde, is a really important kind of intervention in the conversation and in highlighting the layers of meaning in Caribbean art. So thank you, Therese, for that.
Well,
and I also acknowledge my the 1 or 2 students of mine who did actually come today.
I will start there. I think I just want to thank my students as well, both current and former, who showed up for this. And I think the volume of them that are in the room, Therese, is testament to the currency of this book and what it is trying to unpack. And it is a very complex space. And I think for those of us who teach and engage with young artists, what we're trying to do is to give them a sense of the skill and for want of a better term, autonomy in their practice, but at the same time, a real sense of context. And I think this helps that conversation move forward. So thank you.
And for someone, I was speaking with Petrina earlier, saying I feel like an interloper at times in terms of the visual art world, but certainly I do see the merits of this work, Therese, as really existing truly as an interdisciplinary conversation across many creative disciplines, and also within the position of cultural studies and the various intellectual moves of our very own Caribbean-based cultural studies and the Caribbean intellectual history of which the text engages. And so a true tour de force, a complex, dense, but delightful read. And I really want to, we're lucky, we're indeed lucky to have you here with us and in the Department of Cultural Studies and in the faculty, and also serving the Barbados Community College and the various young people who knock on your door, break bread with you, share space with you, converse and with you, cry with you, and all, share their frustrations and their elations. So you have been a true pillar in the Barbadian community. And we thank you. We thank you for this labor of love. And we thank you for what you continue to do and provide and give to the Cultural Studies program, a cheerleader for the students, rallying them along for those who are currently engaging in their PhDs, and someone who literally came through the entire ranks of an MA and then went through to the PhD, and now with this publication and now a lecturer in the program. We are truly delighted to see this trajectory as it has evolved over, I don't want to age you, but over some time, and and what you now add to our faculty and the interdisciplinary conversations that we are hoping to have. We have our faculty week commencing on the February 15th, well, 14th, where this will be aired again, but the week of the 14th through the 19th, the Faculty of Culture, Creative and Performing Arts will be featured with a series of conversations. You get a peek into classes. Dr. Rainey Demerson in our dance program will be sharing her course, a kind of insight into her classes, as well as the festival's course by Dr. Burrows. So there'll be many opportunities to engage with us again. Of course, the artist speaking to artists or talking to artists. Look out for that series, which will commence in March. Again, thank you all. Thank you, students. Thank you, artists who are with us. And thank you, panelists. Thank you, Therese. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much. Yeah.